Today's texts are Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, and Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 32 and 33. You can find Exodus 3 on page 44 in the Pew Bibles. Deuteronomy 1 can be found on page 138. The Exodus text describes no ordinary happening. The narrative features an angel, messenger, a bush that burns but is not burned, and God's own voice. This is a peculiar genre, a vehicle for the appearance of God's presence, God's first presence in the Exodus narrative. The Deuteronomy text was composed at the time when a continuation of Israel's existence as a state with a land and a kingship of its own was all but at end. This is essentially twilight literature. It was written in the shadow of catastrophe, when much of Israel's territory had been lost and when defeat had faced the nation many times, when the great expectations associated with the days of David and Solomon were a richly covered memory. I invite you to listen with awe and wonder to the great I Am, the one who invites us to new and wondrous possibilities. Listen well, for we worship on holy ground. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, when he led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called out to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Exodus 3. But in spite of this, you have no trust in the Lord your God, who goes before you on the way to seek out a place for you to camp. In fire by night and in the cloud by day, to show you the route you should take. Deuteronomy. This ends the reading.
Good morning. Before I begin, I just would like to say two quick things. First and foremost, what an honor it is to be back up here with you. Some of you know that 3.5 years ago, I had a little bump in the road, and your prayers, your comments, your continued concern has helped me get to this point where, thank God, I am doing well, and I just wanted to make sure you knew how much your prayers and all your thoughts have meant to me over these years. And second, being Jewish today is not so easy. It can feel isolating. It can feel alone. Many of my congregants come to me and say, should we keep wearing our Star of David? Is it okay to say that I'm Jewish? And so there's a real feeling of isolation among many of us. And yet, here in Manhattan Beach, we have MBCC by our side. And your friendship, your kindness, your constant love allows us to walk with our head held high. And I just wanted to say, on behalf of my community, thank you. Words will never, ever fully be able to express how important this relationship is to us and how your love helps us keep going. So thank you. Thank you to Pastor Mike, and thank you to your beautiful community for having me. All right. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Sitting in the front seat of a car, what parent hasn't heard that over and over again? Are we there yet? When are we going to be there? Are we there yet? You may be asking the same question this morning. Are we there yet? Or maybe that just happens during a 2.5-hour synagogue service. But I wanna say something about that question, not only on trips, but I'm gonna start off with trips. Growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and by the way, I'm rooting for Stanford. Sorry, just putting that in there. I grew up 20 minutes from Stanford. It's a beautiful place. Growing up in the Bay Area, the trip we would take most often was to Lake Tahoe, almost monthly. Just like in New York, you go off to the Hamptons. In Southern California, you go to Big Bear or Palm Springs. In the Midwest, I don't know where you go. It's just what you do. But we as a family, we would go to Tahoe. And sometimes you focus more on being there than you do on getting there. So I guess I was 7 or 8 years old when we were getting ready to go to Tahoe. And my mother said to me, put the food in these bags in the trunk of the car. So I went and I carried out her wishes, and we drove the 4.5 hours to Tahoe, and she opened up the trunk and it was empty. And she said to me, did you put the food in the trunk? And I said, yes, I did. And then she asked a question that I'll never forget. She said, in this car? Now, I attribute the fact that I put the food in the trunk, but in the other car, and never noticed that we were driving to Tahoe in a different car, not to the fact that I didn't notice stuff like that, but because I was so fixed on being in Tahoe that I didn't think about getting there. And I bring this up because for so many of us, this season, whether you celebrate Easter or you celebrate Passover, in some ways are holidays where the journey is just as important as the arrival. One of the remarkable things about the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is that the Israelites never get there. You start off in Genesis and end with Deuteronomy, and the text is all about entering the land of Israel. We're told what's going to happen when we enter the land, how wonderful it's going to be, and we're liberated from Egypt so we can get to the land. And then you finish the book of Deuteronomy, and we're still in the desert. It's a book without an arrival. And it's true that we get there in the book of Joshua, but that's not included in the 5 books of Moses. And it's not really the great climax that we expect from the journey. You get the sense that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are all about the journey and not about the arrival. In fact, there's a beautiful commentary by the Jewish commentator named Rashi, who is one of the most famous that we have. And at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy, when it says that God was with Israel in all their journeys, he says, well, what about when they camped? After all, they weren't walking all day and night. There was a cloud by day, there was a fire by night to show God's presence. But what happened when they stopped? And his answer is that even when they encamped, they were called journeys. In other words, even when you are solitary, even when you are still, if your spirit is alive, you're on a journey. We have a natural tendency as human beings to look only at the goal and not the journey. If we only get to this place, everything will be fine. We do this to ourselves in life. When we're in elementary school, we just want to be in middle school. When we're in middle school, we know everything will be fine when we get to high school. And in high school, everybody focuses on college. And once you're in college, you know your job is going to be what really makes your life whole. And then it's going to be your marriage and your children and getting that promotion and then maybe grandchildren. And all of a sudden, life is winding down and it's over. And then you lived life the way the great Jewish scholar Gershom Scholem said that for too many years, Jews lived this way. He said Jews lived waiting for the Messiah. He said we were always fixed on the Messiah coming. So we lived life in deferment, always deferring what life would be like when the Messiah came. But for those of us today who are less fixed on the Messiah, but more fixed on immediate, tangible goals, we sometimes do the same thing. Are we there yet is another way of saying things won't start until we get there. That's when things will be good. That's when things will be real. That's when things will start. All this intermediate time, it doesn't really count. It counts only when we hit the goal. When we get there, everything will be fine. But of course, deferment is dangerous. It doesn't get more real tomorrow or the day after or when something happens that you're waiting to happen. This is it. As the French writer José Gasset said, life is fired at us point blank. This is as real as it gets, and every moment of it has something. One of the maladies of our society is our fear of boredom. Not only are we afraid of boredom, but we can't stand for our kids to be bored. As though saying I'm bored requires an instant remedy. Well, if you're bored, why don't you? And then we go through all the technological solutions. Turn on your iPad, turn on the computer, watch TV, get on the internet. But the second side of boredom is self-discovery. And if we live in distraction, then we live in deferment. We're not living real. We're not paying attention to the journey. We're only paying attention to the arrival. And if you don't believe me, here's a beautiful letter which I want to read a small excerpt from the Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno. And he's responding to a letter from a young writer. And he says, "My young friend, we can't understand one another. You speak one language and I another, and we both refuse to translate our terms. Just to hear the words you use leaves me still unclear as to your meaning. One of them is the way you use the word arrive. Its meaning has become less and less clear to me. Please explain these phrases from your letters. So-and-so has arrived. John Doe will never arrive. Today is very difficult for a young man to arrive, and other expressions of the sort. What is this business about arriving? Arrive where? There's one but certain arrival, and that is death. And that might be better termed a departure." What he's saying to him is, and this is from somebody who is famous and celebrated, that arrival isn't what you think it is. That if you ask most people the happiest times of their lives, it's the journey, not the instant you get the gold watch that signals the retirement at which you have told yourself, as soon as I can do that, as soon as I can retire, as soon as the journey is over, then I can really enjoy myself. As if, as Thoreau said, you could kill time without injuring eternity. It's as if you could live your life always waiting for the next day and not destroy the day you have. Most of the Torah is actually not about Israel, but about the journey. Most of it is about getting there, about the wilderness, because that's where we live. And the quality of your life will be measured not in where you get at the end, but in the steps you took along the way. People who say, I really want to do this, I really want to see this place, spend more time with those I love, read this book, do something valuable, but not yet. Not yet. In time, the time will come. Well, the Jewish sage Hillel anticipated this thousands of years ago, and he said, "Don't say about the Torah that I'll study it when I get the time, for you may never have the time." The journey is what we get. We don't get the arrival all the time. And all of life is about being alive to the wonders, the beauties, the mystery, the love, the responsibility of being on the journey. It is, in the words of William James, all of life is about creating something that will outlast it. It's about self-transcendence, not about distractions, not about pulling yourself away from yourself, not about being there yet, but about getting there now. I bring all this up because this is not only the Passover story Jews are about to celebrate, but it's also the story of the man around whom the Passover story is based. One of the peculiar things of the Torah is that it doesn't really tell us why God chooses who God chooses. All of a sudden, God comes out of the sky and says, "Abraham, guess what?" And we don't really know why. The rabbis tell all stories as to maybe why it's Abraham breaking his father's idols and so on, but the Torah doesn't specifically say it. Just one day, God wants this guy. And of course, with the principal mission of the Passover story, that's the mission of Moses, we don't really know why Moses is chosen, but we have a beautiful hint. You remember, as was shared a moment ago, when God first appeared to Moses at the burning bush, God doesn't just appear at the burning bush. What happens is that Moses was pastoring the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, and then it says, as was shared, there was a bush, and the bush was on fire, but it didn't turn to ashes. It was not consumed. And Moses noticed, and he said in Hebrew, "Asurana ve'ereh," which means, I'm going to turn aside and look at this bush. And then the Torah tells us that when God saw Moses turn aside, God said, "Moses, Moses." So the Jewish tradition says the bush had been burning since the beginning of time, and millions of people had walked by it. And they thought, what's the big deal? A brush fire in the desert. They didn't notice. But Moses was alive. Moses paid attention. Moses cared about the journey. And that's why, even though Moses famously never arrives in the land of Israel, he's the most important personality in the Jewish tradition, because Moses' entire life is about the journey. If in fact his life was judged by whether he got there, he would have been a failure. But he wasn't, because the same Moses who noticed the bush noticed the Israelites. There's a beautiful phrase at the end of the Torah when Moses says goodbye to the Israelites. The Hebrew phrase is, "Lo yachol latzet velavo." He can't go out and he can't come in. And that's a Hebrew idiom for meaning he no longer has vigor. In other words, he's dying. But the Jewish tradition saw it differently. They said, what did it mean when Moses could no longer go out and go in? It meant that at the very end of his life, he went in and out of every single tent of every Israelite to say goodbye. He went in, he said, "I'm leaving you now," and then he went on to the next tent and the next tent. And when he had gone to the tent of every Israelite and no longer had to go in to see anyone anymore, he went out up to Mount Nebo. He crossed his hands over his chest and he said goodbye to the world. In other words, for Moses, there was no destination. There was a journey, not of distraction, not of pulling himself away from others and away from God, but of awareness, of decency, of goodness, and of love. In this season of Lent and Easter, of preparation and Passover, I hope that we will remind ourselves that everything we need to lead a good life is here with us right now. That we need not live life in deferment. We don't have to wait till next month, till next year. Our Seder meal ends with the phrase, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, which doesn't mean that this year doesn't count. It does. It counts for us and accounts for the message that we send to our children, which is every day is real, every day matters, and life is not where you end up. Life is all about the journey. In this season, let us remember that the essential act of leaving slavery in all of its forms is the beginning of the journey, is the freedom of self-creation, is the chance to cross the wilderness together, hand in hand, looking towards the land, knowing where we're going, whether we arrive or not, because if we journey together, then we will bless one another and be blessed by God. Thank you.